Good morning and welcome back. This is our news update coming to you live from Warsaw. I'm Saria Strzemska. Russia's recent intensification of drone incursions into NATO states might be a part of a broader tactic to normalize provocations from the Kremlin and hinder support for Ukraine. But at the same time, Russia fails to make a clear point with these actions, and the tactic will most likely fail. That's according to Keir Giles, senior consulting fellow from the Chatham House, who spoke with TVP World.
Certainly a lot of people are talking about this as an escalation, as a new stage in the confrontation between Russia and the West. But, of course, it has to be placed in context. It may be that there's a slight increase in the intensity of these attacks, but, of course, it comes at the end of a long period during which these have become more and more bold, more and more assertive, more and more aggressive. And a lot of experts that are analyzing this are assuming that this is part of the Russian tactics, to make these things normalized, to make them less shocking, so that the drone incursions, the shutdowns of airports, the cyber attacks, the assassinations, the sabotage are all part of the background noise. At the same time, you've got other explanations that actually Russia wants to make a point with this, that it is trying to deter Europe from supporting Ukraine and from resisting what Russia wants to achieve. But if that's the case, of course, there's a missing element to this. Russia is doing the punishment but not explaining what it is for, so it will not have the desired effect.
Poland significantly lags behind the EU average level of electric vehicle registrations. That's according to new figures. A report by the Polish Association of New Mobility suggests at the current rate the country will take nearly 4 years to reach EV registration rates seen in some other European countries. Researchers said the number of fully electric vehicles more than doubled in the first 3 quarters of the year to reach a market share of 8%. They noted that subsidies from a government program were a key factor contributing to the growing popularity of electric cars in Poland. However, the scheme will end in June of 2026, likely leading to a temporary decline in EV registrations. Estonian police and border guard closed an Estonian road that cuts through Russian territory on Friday evening after an unusual level of Russian activity that was detected in the area.
On Friday, October 10th, our patrols observed throughout the day that the Russian side was significantly more active than usual in the South area. We saw various armed groups moving on the border and in its immediate vicinity. Judging by their uniforms, they were definitely not border guards. We considered this a threat and made the decision to temporarily close the road through the South Pass.
UK fighter jets flew a 12-hour joint mission with the US and NATO along the eastern flank of the border with Russia on Saturday. UK officials confirmed on Saturday that 2 Royal Air Force aircraft flew a 12-hour mission earlier this week alongside US and NATO forces to patrol the border with Russia amid a series of recent Russian drone and aircraft incursions into NATO airspace. This was a substantial joint mission with our US and NATO allies, Defense Minister John Healey said. The NATO Parliamentary Assembly is holding its 71st annual session in Ljubljana, Slovenia. Julia Osmolowska, head of the Globsec Kyiv office, is there to discuss the burgeoning Ukrainian defense industry.
Ukraine's defense industry is actually serving with 5-fold effect, I would say. First is a backstop for deterrence, definitely. Second, it's the booster to economic and business activity in Ukraine. Also a booster for technologies, but also a complementary part or a sort of incentive that actually also somehow stimulated the growth of Europe's defense industry and also some perspective options for the future.
Now, tragic news from the United States. Officials say there are no survivors from a massive explosion at a military explosives company in Tennessee. Investigators report that the 16 people still missing are all presumed to have been killed in Friday's blast.
These aerial images show the extent of the damage. What was once a production facility levelled by the power of the blast. The local sheriff said there were no survivors from Friday's explosion.
That question, I can tell you at this time, we have notified all 16 families of those people that we feel was involved in this situation, this tragedy.
Previously, officials said 18 people were missing, but they located 2 workers who were not on site at the time of the disaster. Investigators, including agents from the FBI and the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms and Explosives, are working to determine the cause of the explosion. The presence of explosives and other ordnance at the property has complicated the search of the scene.
China's Ministry of Commerce accused the United States on Sunday of applying, quote, double standards and warned that Washington's threat to impose additional 100% tariffs in response to Beijing's tightening controls on rare earth exports could further escalate tensions between the two countries. The ministry further emphasized that the United States was overstretching the concept of national security by abusing its export controls, calling the practice harmful to China's interests. It added that Beijing hopes Washington will take steps to correct its actions. While China does not seek a tariff war with the United States, it said it would take appropriate measures to protect its rights if necessary. The warning follows US President Donald Trump's announcement on Friday that additional tariffs, effective November 1st, will be imposed in response to what he described as, quote, extremely aggressive new Chinese rare earth export restrictions. Poland's conservative opposition party Law and Justice staged a protest in Warsaw on Saturday against EU migration policies and the Mercosur trade deal, accusing the government of betraying national and agricultural interests. To take this thing out of the protest, Prime Minister Donald Tusk claimed that Poland clinched an agreement with the European Commission securing Poland's exclusion from the EU's migration pact. He also vowed to defend farmers against unfair competition.
Poland's largest opposition party, Law and Justice, held an anti-immigration and anti-government demonstration this Saturday in Warsaw. The event began after 2 p.m. local time and lasted approximately 2.5 hours. An estimated 10,000 to 15,000 people gathered during the demonstration at Castle Square. Protesters voiced opposition against the EU's migration pact, which enters into force next year. Prime Minister Donald Tusk assured on social media platform X that Poland will be excluded from the pact.
I said there would be no relocation of migrants in Poland, and there won't be. It's settled. I said we would tighten security on the border with Belarus, and it is currently the most secure border in Europe. I said we would tighten visa and asylum regulations, and Poland has become a role model for others. We're doing it, not just talking about it.
EU officials have not yet confirmed that Poland would be treated differently. However, in February, European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen said that EU would take into account the extraordinary solidarity Poland has shown toward Ukrainian refugees when it implements the Migration Pact. The EU Migration Pact includes mandatory solidarity measures regarding issues like relocation of migrants within EU countries, faster border procedures and stronger external border controls to balance responsibility among member states. Countries where migrants first arrive will now be able to relocate a total up to 30,000 migrants per year to other EU member states. The alternative is for those countries to pay a €20,000 contribution for each person they refuse to receive. The protesters also included Polish farmers who, together with right-wing politicians and sympathizers, came to protest against the Mercosur agreement intended to facilitate the import of certain agricultural products from Latin America to EU countries.
It will, we could say will, kill our farmers and our agriculture.
Mainly plant and animal production, especially where vegetables are concerned. The situation in Polish farming is now at a breaking point.
To keep that unity.
In September, the European Commission submitted the agreement for ratification to the European Council. The European Parliament also has to approve the deal.
The vote is open.
However, it remains uncertain whether the final step for the EU to conclude the agreement will go ahead smoothly. The deal, which liberalizes trade between Mercosur countries, Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay and Uruguay, and the EU, reduces tariffs on many products, including some agricultural goods, raising concerns among European farmers about facing unfair competition from Latin American producers. Recently, some Polish farmers organized self-harvest giveaways of their plums and peppers because the cost of harvesting them would have exceeded their profits.
The problems with the peppers and the plums is not about Mercosur. It's about the distribution chains in Europe, where the farmers are getting paid very little for their produce, which is then being sold expensively by the distribution chain.
Supporters of the Mercosur deal argue it's necessary to successfully face Chinese competition and diversify trading partners in the changing global trade environment.
Poland will oppose Mercosur. We want to at least demonstrate that we will not back down when it comes to the interests of Polish agricultural producers.
But the deal's opponents fear Mercosur countries will not comply with European phytosanitary and environmental standards, and as a result, will be able to sell cheaper but lower quality food products. The plenary vote on the Mercosur agreement itself has not yet been scheduled. According to the European Parliament, it could appear on the MEP's agenda by the end of the year. For TVP World, Gabriela Jelonek.
Serbia's President Alexander Vučić and the Students in Blockade movement, which has organized months of mass protests calling for snap elections, are at an impasse. Helena Ivanov, Associate Research Fellow at the Henry Jackson Society, told TVP World. She added that despite growing government pressure, the demonstrators were not backing down.
The government has been paying and bribing multiple people across many different cities to organize protests against the blockade. So it doesn't seem at all that the government is really trying to strike a reconciliatory tone. As for the students themselves, when the protests began, they had multiple different demands, including that they wanted all documentation pertaining to the reconstruction of the train station to be published, a demand that was never met. However, after many, many months of protests, in May of this year, the students basically said that they do not believe this government has legitimacy, that they do not believe that this government will ever fulfill their demands, and that their only demand is snap elections. The students are basically saying that they will have their own list of prospective MP candidates of 250 names. They're now saying that that list is almost 99% complete, but they will not announce the names on that list until President Vučić calls for snap elections. And obviously, I should also say here that President Vučić so far hasn't shown an intention to call for those snap elections. So again, the country is stuck.
After French President Emmanuel Macron reappointed Sébastien Lecornu as Prime Minister following his resignation earlier this week, hopes are now high that the Loyalists will be able to draw enough support from the deeply divided parliament to pass the 2026 budget. The two main sticking points are how to tackle France's budget deficit and reform the French welfare system.
Where do we find the money? How we are going to tax a certain number of incomes of, let's say, the high level or the high rank, the biggest companies who are supposed to be more pushed to give back a certain number of aids, a certain number of loans. This is what the extreme left is proposing. And of course, the pension reform is absolutely essential. And it's another essential issue. We need a budget. We need to have a consensus of whether or not we're going to reform the pension or the so-called model of the French social welfare, which will allow us to have 3 to 4 billion of euros of economy each year, and by, again, for the next 10 years, 13 billion of euros. So it's not only about figures, it's the way we present it, is who is going to be taxed, who and what type of policy are we going through? Are we going through a social dedicated policy, or are we going, as the entrepreneurs are asking us, for less public investment and a bit more aid to private companies?
And with this, we conclude our news update. Thank you for watching, and please stay tuned for more.